What's up, you guys? It's Kristen Feemster, licensed therapist and wellness coach, and today we are talking about boundaries and boundaries in particular in our relationships. This is going to be one of the most freeing videos that you watch because relationships make it very hard to create the boundaries that we probably need to live a better, healthier lifestyle across the board, relationally, personally, all of the above. When I think about why boundaries are so difficult in relationships, it just automatically points to the complexity of relationships. Relationships are rarely black and white, all right? And boundaries are easier to set when there's a clear right and there's a clear wrong. But what happens when you have history with the person that you're in a relationship with, emotions are involved in the relationship, now it becomes a little trickier to figure out where that line is. In fact, a lot of it is just blurred gray area stuff that we have to figure out on a case by case basis for the most part. And so all of this makes it hard for us to not only identify our boundaries, but to stand firm in them because it always depends, right? And we also have to sit with the discomfort of the emotional or relational impact that it's going to have on both people in order to set the boundaries. And so if you are finding that you are struggling with setting relationship boundaries, you are not alone. I also think that a lot of us were not really taught how to do this in a very direct way. You know, maybe you grew up observing boundaries be in place or not, but no one was really sitting you down and saying, hey, so here's what a boundary is, right? And when I tell you X, Y, and Z, this is me setting a healthy boundary with you that both honors my self-respect and your ability to choose the life that you want to live. Like, nobody's saying that growing up. We just kind of observe people in relationship. And then we draw our conclusions as to how that happened or what was done or what wasn't done. We have no idea what their inner thoughts were around how they were showing up. We have no idea of any side conversations within relationships we observed to know exactly what the boundaries were, what the expectations were. We're just guessing. You know what I mean? We're just jumping to conclusions, guessing, gleaning what we can. And then what happens? All of a sudden we grow up and we find ourselves in close friendships, close romantic relationships, and then continued relationships with our family of origin, you know, our siblings and our parents, trying to figure out that now that I have an understanding of who I am, and now I have some life history with me, like, what does it really sound like to set boundaries around what's okay with me and what's not okay with me, or what I'm comfortable with and what I'm not comfortable with? We really don't get the blueprint for that until a time like this video. So not only do we not have a blueprint for how to set boundaries, we also don't have a rule book of how to handle the emotions that can come up from setting boundaries. You know, we might feel guilty, we might feel obligated, we might feel disrespected or like they won't be honored or not heard. You know what I mean? We might feel exhausted around the relationship, and all of these things make it even more difficult to figure out, where does the line need to be? What do I need to articulate? I'm not operating at my best emotionally. I'm overwhelmed. I'm frustrated. And now I'm having to show up and articulate this well-formed boundary in order to create a different dynamic in the relationship. And all of that's really hard. And usually when we feel guilty and exhausted and fearful and all the things, we tend to just hide. And that leads me to the ways that we misuse boundaries in our relationships. I think that a lot of times what we deem to be boundaries is really just some sort of dysfunction still. Kind of dysfunction with a pretty bow on it, if you could say that. And so one way that we misuse boundaries is using it to avoid hard conversations, or using it to avoid really addressing issues and setting like real boundaries. And so when I think of this, I don't think of no contact completely, but sometimes, there is a space for no contact in our relationships, but sometimes we err on the side of just, I'm not going to call them ever again, or I'm going to ghost them, or we're just going to give silent treatment, or we're going to stonewall, or we're going to go no contact. And the reason why is because we are uncomfortable with addressing the issue face to face, right? We're non-confrontational. We don't want to ruffle any feathers. Maybe we don't view it as being worth it to address. But either way, boundaries are not really meant to just avoid issues at hand. They're meant to be a tool to help you work towards an understanding and a compromise around what's permissible and what's not in a relationship. Another way that we misuse boundaries is that we sometimes use them to control other people. At the end of the day, we all have autonomy around how we live our lives. And so if you find that you are creating and curating boundaries in order to make someone change something about themselves for you, that's not necessarily a boundary. A boundary says that this is what I'm going to do with my life. This is what's okay here. And you can be who you want to be. And that can be separate from me, at a distance from me, whatever the case may be. But if you know within yourself that your intentions in articulating a quote unquote boundary is so that that other person will do what you want them to do. And that's something that we have to check ourselves on. Other people may not always understand the intentions and the motivators behind the boundaries that we set. And that's really a place where we have to be honest with ourselves. Another way that we sometimes misuse boundaries is by weaponizing them, using them as a threat, using them as a way to put fear in somebody else around what they may or may not do. And I think about this in abusive relationships where, there might be a financial boundary, but it's really kind of being held over somebody's head to make them do something or not do something. And again, that's kind of like the cousin of using it for control. But if it's a fear tactic, if it's a way to prevent somebody from doing what is ultimately up to them to do, or if it's a way for you to get out of addressing an issue head on, then those are all ways that we potentially misuse boundaries in our relationships. So now I'm going to tell you 3 different ways you can set boundaries that are, I promise you, going to transform your relationships. And the first one is one that I always find myself talking more about with people around how they spend time with family, particularly around the holidays or just more traditional moments throughout our lives. And that is a time boundary. Did you know that you can just put a limit on the amount of time you spend around certain family members or even certain friends or certain groups of people that sometimes I think we feel that if I'm going to go, then it's just all bets are off and I'm just have to be exposed until it's over, right? But really you can decide that I'm going to go and visit this side of my family or this particular person, but I'm going to give myself, again, you see how that has nothing to do with how they're showing up, nothing to do with what they say or don't say, that sort of thing. That has solely to do with you and how you want to spend your time. And so a time boundary is one where you say, hey, I'm going to go visit my family member. I'm going to stay for 2 hours and then I'm going to give myself permission to leave. The freedom, you guys, that comes with knowing you don't just have to stay somewhere and endure whatever, is going on there for forever is so freeing to people, particularly around the holidays and just, birthday parties and family reunions. Another one adjacent to that one is physical boundaries. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to about you don't have to go and stay in the home with a family member in order to visit them and stay overnight. Now, I know this brings up other, questions as far as financial ability to do this, but staying elsewhere, going and staying at a hotel instead of at someone's home, if that feels like it'll allow for a healthier engagement with your family members or whoever you're thinking about with this example, then that is something that you can give yourself. I know it may be different than what your family's used to or what you're used to, but that is something, that is a boundary that you are allowed to decide on for yourself. Another boundary that is going to free you is emotional boundaries. It is not your responsibility to take care of someone else's emotion regulation. Okay, so we do have, I guess it depends on how you feel about relationships, but we do have to understand how our actions impact other people, and the probability of different emotions arising based on what the nature of the conversation is or the action, that sort of thing. However, when it comes to someone regulating themselves and soothing themselves and problem solving their own lives, that is ultimately up to that person. The only way this is different is when we're in a parental role and we are teaching a child how to regulate their emotions. In that regard, sometimes we do have to step in to help teach and model emotion regulation in a way that does influence them. But once we get to our big grown age, now it's up to that person to soothe their own anger, to figure out what they need when they're upset, right? To allow their own tears to flow or not, and to process sadness or process grief or whatever has come up for them. But whenever we take that on, that not only do I need to regulate myself and take my own deep breaths, but then now I got to somehow figure out how to jump into their body and make them feel better. That is a sign that we are leaning towards being codependent and definitely needing some emotional boundaries. If you find yourself over explaining a decision that you come to, or trying to change the way that you are moving in a relationship in order to avoid someone getting upset, like maybe walking on eggshells or not showing up authentically, I think that is a telltale sign that there are some emotional boundaries needed. And this is the hardest one to implement, but it's essentially continuing to redirect and regroup yourself from feeling responsible for someone else's emotions. So that means sometimes we might have to sit in the discomfort of someone being upset in our presence. And we also have to sit in the discomfort of us feeling a little bit of guilt and not feeling like we have to bail on it. Okay. Sometimes when we feel uncomfortable or, something's a little bit off, we automatically think we got to do something to patch it over. And so if you are needing emotional boundaries, leaning into that guilt and that discomfort a little bit is setting the emotional boundary. It's allowing that person to take care of themselves and you to take care of yourselves, and realizing that we're going to be okay on the other side of this. It's not up to me to make sure that this person doesn't have any other emotion besides happiness and joy. That's really ultimately up to them. And when they get ready to, say what that looks like for them, they will communicate that with me. And then in relationship, we can figure out how to support each other. But ultimately, we have to realize we can't do that for someone else. Another boundary that is going to help free you in your relationships is allowing yourself to pause before you say yes. So not just not being so agreeable to every single thing. Even if you are going to agree, I would suggest just give yourself some time to pause and say, you know what? If someone asks you to do something, and sometimes people don't ask us to do stuff and we do it anyway, but that's a whole nother conversation. But in this situation, if someone asks us to do something, sometimes because of the history we have with them, because it feels urgent by way of how they're communicating it, or just any other obligation, responsibility that we feel like we need to answer right then and right there. And sometimes our immediate response is not necessarily the healthiest response. So what I would suggest do is allow yourself to pause. That's a boundary. Just pause. You haven't said yes. You haven't said no. You haven't even answered. You're just like, you know what? Let me think about that and I'm going to get back to you. That just gives you a little bit more time to assess your energy level, your capacity, to understand the full dynamic of what's being asked of you, to understand the impact or the consequences of agreeing to whatever was asked of you or not. And then you can make a decision based off of a rational thought process and not just off of reflex. So if you find yourself saying yes to everything without thought, a boundary for you in that, and also a boundary with them, would be to allow yourself some sort of grace, some sort of pause period where you don't have to answer and you can just consider all options before saying yes or before saying no. Again, like I said at the beginning of this video, setting boundaries in relationships is very difficult. So once you start to do this, it's going to be rocky for a little bit, and that's to be expected. All right. So go into this process. If you are wanting to work on this area of boundaries for yourself, you got to go into this process realizing it's going to be a little bit rocky. Okay. People aren't used to me showing up this way. I'm going to lean in and sit in that discomfort and allow people to get accustomed to how I'm showing up now, right? Give yourself grace, give them grace, give yourself the benefit of the doubt, and have more confidence in the people around you that we are pretty adaptable when we want to be. And so that if I need to set a boundary with someone in my life that I'm in relationship with, have faith and have confidence that you all can withstand the need for a boundary. I hope this was helpful to you. And again, remember that some of the healthiest things that we can do in our relationships will be uncomfortable at first, but it will pay off in the long run. So be patient, stay consistent, and always, always, always give yourself grace. All right. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next video.